The warning klaxons had not sounded because the system had not recognized a threat pattern familiar enough to trigger defense protocols, and by the time the oversight was corrected and the algorithms recalibrated, the scout vessel Vorthalandic, bearing the triple insignia of the Volantar Empire's observational covenant, had already been struck by a kinetic lance of Terran origin, an object primitive in composition, unassuming in profile, and devastating in result. Having passed through the shielding mesh, as if the laws of force and reaction had been bypassed by something more fundamental, and ancient archivist Caloran Vosk stood in the observation deck of the Velenarch's inner sanctum, surrounded by data, streams that flickered with inconsistencies, historical overlays, and predictions that now tasted of irrelevance. His face a lattice of ceremonial scars representing peace achieved through preservation of knowledge, not conquest, and though he had long abandoned the tendency to display emotional variance common to younger Velenborn, there was a quiet tremor in the dilation of his pupils and the tightening of his tertiary jawplate that betrayed concern he was unwilling to verbalize. He was one of the oldest living keepers of the Interstellar Accord archives, a diplomat by design, forged not in battle but in the slow, painful process of reconciling alien sovereignties through record, interpretation, and truth sculpted with linguistic precision. And it was through this lens that he now viewed Earth not as an aggressor but as a paradox, a species whose name was often mentioned in distant council halls with detached curiosity, a relic race constrained to their system by the slow crawl of gravity and radiation, and yet now capable of surgical orbital retaliation without broadcast, without fanfare, and without any preceding declaration or protocol of engagement. Standing to Vosk's left, a towering silhouette clad in refractive crimson war steel, was Fleet Marshal Euronthreck, commander of the Velentar 1st Retaliatory Armada, a creature born not of preservation but escalation, who had earned his seat not by years but by victories, whose command record listed the neutralization of 4 rogue empires and 3 civil war coalitions in less than 2 decades. His voice deep and symmetrical, every word spoken as though it were an edict meant for stone, not air. And it was he who had requested, or rather, demanded the authority to strike back at Earth's perceived transgression with overwhelming scale and calibrated fury. They saw us, Thrak had said moments earlier with a certainty unclouded by data hesitation, and they fired not in defense but in ambush, cloaked or not. Our presence in their system warranted caution at most, not erasure. Not this level of precision, not this expression of capability from a species our records still list as incapable of gravitational lensing or post-light synchronization. Vosk, still studying the last transmissions from Vorthalandic, which included a 6-second burst of visual static, followed by a time-stamped metadata signature that had somehow been overwritten midstream, a feat impossible for any civilization below Tier 4 encryption protocols, had responded not with contradiction but inquiry. For the mark of a scholar was not in what one knew, but in what one asked at the precipice of violence. And he had asked quietly, "Fleet Marshal, what if this was not aggression but evolution, not declaration but reaction, an algorithm testing its dominion, or a warning issued by mistake, yet received by intent?" But Threk had already dismissed the notion, not out of malice or ignorance, but out of a fundamental belief that power left unanswered becomes precedent, and precedent shapes future deterrence, and future deterrence was the domain in which he had built his legacy, not through mercy, but through example, and so the Armada had been readied within 9 cycles, not out of haste, but because the vessels of the Velentar were always in a state of readiness, a lesson learned after the Baral ascendancy and the Jantrax collapse. When delay had cost empires more than blood, it had cost continuity, and continuity was the currency of those who ruled more than one sun. They would not just approach Earth with strength, They would orbit its moon in layered silence, black out its satellites, map its geothermal signatures, and extract behavioral compliance by demonstration, if not dialogue. And all of this while transmitting once and only once. The standard ultimatum phrase of interstellar protocols: stand down, declare intention, or be declared adversarial by consequence of inaction. What unnerved Vosk, though he would never say it aloud in the presence of warriors, was that Earth had received that transmission 26 hours ago, and had responded with absolute silence. There exists in the diplomatic teachings of the Valentar a principle older than their fusion drives and planetary colossi, a doctrine whispered in the folds of ancient parchment scrolls long before they digitized law notion, that silence, when wielded with precision, bears greater mass than 1,000 declarations. For silence cannot be misquoted, nor can it be deflected. It can only be endured or returned. It was precisely this form of silence that now hung across the communication relay spheres of the Velenarch like an invisible atmosphere. Not the silence of broken systems or linguistic incompatibility, but the deliberate kind, the kind that waits, listens, calculates, and then waits further. And in this stillness, Fleet Marshal Euron Threk found an irritation that bordered on doctrinal violation. For every code of military response he knew had been built around escalation curves. An escalation required a trigger, but Earth, this quiet, blue and gray anomaly, had not yet pulled theirs. The Armada approached Mars with layered formation, the planetary shadow playing off the obsidian hulls of 67 dreadnoughts aligned in the wreath configuration. A combat formation reserved only for immediate and total orbital dominance. And yet, no counterforce arrived, no fleet of defiance, not even a planetary broadcast of warning or apology. Nothing but the strange, faint electromagnetic thrum that had been detected days earlier, hovering across Terrancum bands with the subtlety of a breeze, passing through wire what the fleet did encounter unexpectedly, inexplicably with structure. It was first seen by the long-range eyes of the Velencorth, a survey cruiser fitted with Tier 7 gravitational lenses and usually employed for gas giant resource profiling, not battlefield reconnaissance, and what it saw it could not classify. A lattice of reflective debris in stationary orbit above. The sunward face of Mars, each piece anchored by nothing visible, each component precisely positioned, angular in their inconsistencies. A geometry that defied Velen design sensibility, but hinted, unmistakably, at intent. They named it the Tenebris Array only after failing to name it anything else, neither weapon, nor station, nor ship. It emitted no power signature, yet cast shadows in the infrared, absorbed signal in the quantum range, and adjusted its position with a rhythm not entirely mechanical, as if it were listening to some internal beat removed from Timovosk, had been called to the primary bridge chamber for visual assessment, not because the fleet marshal required a scholar's opinion, but because the rest of the command council refused to offer speculation that might later become accountability. And so Vosk, ever the willing vessel of unpleasant interpretation, had stood before the panoramic field screen and said without flourish or hesitation, "This is not defense, it is deterrence. Not aimed to fire, but to be seen, for to build. Such a thing, and leave it dormant, requires a confidence not born of arrogance, but of preparation. And preparation implies intent measured over generations." Threk had dismissed it as theatrical analysis, declaring instead that the humans had constructed a psychological obfuscation grid designed to appear formidable while lacking actual offensive capability. A known tactic of pre-expansion cultures, desperate to inflate perception. But before any offensive maneuver could be executed, the Tenebris Array spoke. It was not a transmission in the traditional sense. No carrier signal, no language. Matrix. Only a sudden ripple through the cum lattice of the fleet's primary node, an old Earth signal type, the kind recorded in Velen archives as VHF radio. a communication relic unused by most civilizations since the age of atmospheric combustion. Engines. The message was delivered in Terran English, one of the dozen or so root tongues the planet had never truly unified, and yet chosen now in this moment for its historical resonance and calculated reach. And it said simply, unidentified. Approach vector. Cease advance. Identify origin. Consequences are pre-assigned. This is Riza Andari, Admiral, Terran Assembly. The name had not appeared in Velan intelligence records, and that in itself was notable. Admirals of that rank were not hidden unless they were meant to be unseen. Threk responded with a declaration of fleet position and a demand for clarification regarding the destruction of Orthalan deck. The message sent with appropriate formality, encrypted along 5 linguistic overlays. A transmission designed to signal readiness without incitement. No response came. Instead, the Tenebris array repositioned 3 of its central nodes. No weapon signature, no launch preparation, only quiet alignment, as if to suggest that it could move faster than the mind could calculate, and that it already had. For 6 Terran hours, the fleet remained motionless, just outside Mars' magnetosphere. Sensors active, cannons warm, engines idle. And across that silence, Vosk began to notice something peculiar in the signal field, a pattern within the noise. Bursts of data too short to carry content, yet too regular to be interference. He isolated one and compared it to historical records. Then another, and by the 12th sample, he froze. These were pings, not from the array, but from the void itself. Echoes, bouncing back from interference layers previously assumed to be background radiation. The Earth was mapping them. Every ship, every plate of armor, every internal heat signature, not passively, but actively. A full-spectrum spatial lattice scan occurring in real time without detection until now. Humanity wasn't watching, humanity was counting. Vosk stepped forward toward the fleet marshal with the smallest gesture of urgency permitted by his caste and said, "They are not silent because they are afraid. Fleet Marshal, they are silent because they are already engaged. Just not in a language we expected." And at that precise moment, from behind the gravity curve of Mercury's darkened orbit, a lance of condensed mass energy surged from deep shadow into the heart of the Volan fleet. It was the first strike, and it did not come from them. The detonation of the Volan Dornas, one of the 12 command dreadnoughts held in reserve at the fleet's rear arc, was not preceded by warning nor heralded by the usual precursors of hostile intent. There was no particle bloom, no buildup of emission, not even a whisper across gravimetric sensors that usually trembled at the hint of high-velocity mass displacement. And yet it happened with surgical precision. A graviton lance tearing through its tertiary hull, plating and collapsing the inner core in a way that looked less like destruction and more like a controlled nullification of space. The resulting collapse did not cascade into adjacent vessels, as Fleet Marshal Euronthrak had feared, but the silence it left behind echoed deeper than any chain reaction detonation could have achieved. And in that silence was not fear but recalibration. Not confusion, but recognition, for the Velantar were not a reckless empire, and when presented with overwhelming evidence, they restructured their tactics, not their ideology, and what had just occurred demanded restructuring at every level of operational assumption. Within moments, countermeasures were activated across the fleet, energy shields calibrated to ripple frequencies, auto-fire protocols overridden by command-level isolation, and proximity arrays scrambled to rescan every cubic meter of soul space within engagement radius, but nothing revealed the origin of the strike. Not a vessel, not a trace of engine residue, not a signal trail to triangulate or a visual spectrum clue to follow. It was Vosk who understood first, not through data, but through pattern recognition refined by centuries of archival exposure, a method alien to soldiers, but instinctual to scholars. And he whispered to the empty space between him and the tactical console, They are using our assumptions against us, not because they have superior power, but because they have read our expectations as we once read theirs. Threk, standing rigid in the central command aperture, narrowed his upper eyes without speaking, though the air around him grew heavier, not from atmospheric adjustment, but from the pressure of what was unspoken, that they had been struck first, that the enemy had fired with precision, and that their own vast intelligence network had failed to predict it before any decision could be made regarding counter-retaliation or fleet dispersal. A second event occurred, not a strike, but a signal. This time, not through standard Terran radio, but via tight beam quantum burst directly into the Ark's encrypted diplomatic relay, a channel that had not been open or advertised, a channel buried beneath 8 layers of protocol, one reserved only for sovereign-to-sovereign first contact. In the event of existential negotiation, Riza Andari's voice returned, but this time not in the cadence of warning or command. We regret the loss of your exploratory vessel. The strike was not authorized by any recognized entity within the Terran Assembly. It was the action of a dormant platform awakened by suborbital interference. The program has since been terminated. We did not seek confrontation, but we are not unprepared for it. There was a pause, not for dramatic effect, but because timing in diplomacy carries weight beyond words, and humans, it seemed, had learned how to wield silence not as absence, but as architecture. The Tenebrese array is not a weapon. It is a deterrent built to suggest possibility, not action. Its presence was your invitation to speak, not to advance. We allowed your fleet this close because fear would have told us to hide. But strategy told us to listen. Now, we listen still. Fleet Marshal Threk did not immediately respond, his pride too vast to collapse in a single moment, but not immune to erosion, and Vosk, seizing the rare gap in command rhythm, stepped forward and addressed the voice lingering in the ships. Acoustics. We acknowledge the message and the consequences that have transpired. This is Archivist Caloran Vosk of the Velantar Council. Your words suggest a framework of response that exceeds your species' known diplomatic capacity. Our records reflect a world still fractured by internal dialects, economic entropy, and biospheric instability. What has changed? There was no immediate reply, and for 3 minutes, which in Velan Command Protocol might as well have been 3 days, nothing but the background hum of reactor systems filled the chamber. Until the voice returned, measured and quiet, a tone neither boastful nor defensive. We failed often, and then we learned from the failures. Then we designed systems that did not forget. What you see is not the evolution of power. It is the accumulation of lessons we refuse to repeat. Andari's voice paused again, but this time, just long. Enough for the meaning to settle into the alloy of command. We understand how to fight, but we understand more why we shouldn't. We don't ask you to trust us. We ask you to listen long enough to see why we deserve your caution. Threk turned away from the console, walking toward the center of the bridge where holographic displays of Earth, its moons, and the Tenebrese array hovered in silent rotation. And in that walk, Vosk recognized something shift, not defeat, nor even concession, but the subtle transition of a warrior understanding that his battlefield had moved beyond reach, that the true weapons were now words and memory and implication, not projectiles or lance arrays, the command staff still locked. In-combat readiness began to falter in their tension, one by one lowering their alert stances as the realization dawned that their mission's narrative had collapsed not under fire, but under perspective. Earth had not escalated. Earth had not retaliated. Earth had waited, and in doing so, had seized control of the rhythm of war without a single fleet in motion. The question now was not how the Velantar would respond to Earth. It was whether they would be permitted to do so at Alin, the 31st cycle of the Velantar diplomatic calendar. The Council of Interspatial Governance had formally codified the doctrine of deterrence, a principle that stated with mathematical exactitude the conditions under which a civilization, upon acquiring advanced strike capability, would either invite annihilation through arrogance or prevent it through restraint. And it was within this framework that archivist Caloran Vosk now reevaluated every assumption, every record, and every precedent regarding the species now known no longer simply as Terrans, but as strategists of consequence from the main observation sphere. Earth appeared, as it always had in Velen Record's delicate in hue, burdened by hydrospheric imbalance, irradiated by its own seasonal axis, and encircled by a belt of derelict satellites and fragmented orbital clutter that once had signified technological adolescence asterisk, but now, even this chaotic ring-bore structure invisible to the impatient eye, each debris cluster emitted faint bursts of patterned interference, and when mapped in time sequence, they formed a perimeter algorithm, a living lattice of orbital choreography designed not merely to obstruct, but to monitor, not to defend in reaction, but to preempt detection. An information net cast wide across low Earth space, whose function was neither purely military nor entirely scientific. It was, Vosk realized with a mounting sense of reluctant admiration, a living protocol, an adaptive architecture woven across metal and vacuum, built not to defy war, but to delay its inevitability long enough for diplomacy to arrive first. And yet, this was not the most unsettling revelation of the hour from the command deck of the Velen Ark. Fleet Marshal Euronthreck reviewed the incoming telemetry from one of the forward advance ships, the Valansorith, a light-class recon frigate designed for interstellar environmental intrusion and spectral espionage, which had positioned itself above Earth's south pole and attempted to scan deep into the crust using subharmonic resonance. The scan had failed not because of interference, but because Earth had answered. A returning pulse had been sent matching frequency, amplitude, and vector sent not as disruption, but as acknowledgement, as if to say, "We know what you're doing, and we're letting you know that we know such behavior was not only unexpected, it was deeply unnatural." Most civilizations reacted to stealth scanning with denial, evasion, or aggressive countermeasures. But Earth's response was subtle, strategic, and profoundly psychological. They want us to question the depth of what they're hiding, Threck said at last, his voice low but firm. And they want us to understand that the absence of aggression is not absence of capability. It is position, calculated and chosen. It was then, without alarm or announcement, that another vessel emerged from Earth's orbit, not from a docking station or a planetary lift ring, but from within the obscured interior of the Tenebris array itself, a single human ship marked only with a minimal identifier, T.A. Skyber, a name without symbolic aggression, a silhouette without offensive profile, unshielded, unarmed, but transmitting openly on Velen diplomatic channels in a protocol syntax nearly indistinguishable from the Council's own. It was approaching the Velen Ark alone. The command staff flinched, instinctively preparing countermeasures. But Vosk raised his left hand, the scholar's mark for pause and observe, a gesture so ancient that even warriors dared not interrupt it, and leaned forward as if his breath might interfere with the unfolding calculus of diplomacy. The T.A. Skyber halted exactly 4.07 kilometers from the Ark's hull, a distance calculated not for safety, but for visual scale, to ensure that every sensor and viewport could observe its details, not through threat but through presence. And then the channel opened. A face appeared on the bridge's central console, not artificial, not animated, but human, unmistakably, unflinchingly real. Fleet Marshal Euronthreck, came the voice of Admiral Reza Andari. No longer a message fragment, but a living transmission, her tone calm, her posture disciplined, her uniform marked with emblems that defied Velen classification, yet bore the quiet authority of unification. "I come unarmed, not as weakness, but as clarity," she said. every word pronounced with precise gravity. And I stand before your dreadnought not in challenge, but in expectation, for your fleet entered our system unannounced, cloaked, and after we extended. Open channels 3 times. Your silence spoke in place of words. Thus our systems responded not with war, but with proof that Earth is not what you once believed. Threk did not respond immediately, and Vosk, sensing the shifting weight of command, stepped beside him and addressed her through formal relay. You claim the destruction of our vessel was unintentional, and you justify it with systems logic. Yet no prior record indicates that Earth has developed predictive intercept capabilities or latent kinetic deterrence operating without human oversight. How do you explain this evolution? In absence of documented technological sequence? Andari did not smile, but there was a shift in her voice measured, not condescending, just enough to signal that the question itself betrayed an outdated lens. You are asking the wrong question, Archivist, she said, her eyes not breaking contact. We did not evolve without pattern. We evolved outside of the one you were watching. The implication Narration continued, her voice unbroken. You observed us for centuries, but you assumed that development is always visible, always linear, always declared through planetary-scale projects and energy signatures. But humans evolved their defense doctrine through software, silence, and simulation. We simulated every first contact scenario for 200 years. You were one of thousands. Your response, your vector, your formation, all were predicted with 91% accuracy. We did not prepare for you by studying your wars. We prepared by studying your patterns of logic and failure. Threk finally spoke, his voice not angered, but sharpened by disbelief, turned into reluctant comprehension. You are saying you anticipated us without ever meeting us? No, Andari said. We anticipated that someone like you would come, and for the first time in over 1,000 cycles, Fleet Marshal Euron Threk, commander of the largest retaliatory force in Velentar history, stepped back from his own declaration and said nothing within the command sanctuary of the Velenarch, designed not merely to coordinate war, but to project the scale of Velentar intent across civilizations. The stillness that followed Admiral Riza Andari's statement lingered in a way no silence ever had before, not as absence, but as confrontation delivered without violence, a mirror held against the face of superiority, and in that reflection was not weakness, but a type of strength the Velentar had never been forced to confront. Vosk did not look at Threk, for to do so would be to acknowledge a moment the Fleet Marshal would not allow to be defined externally. And Vosk understood that there are defeats that do not occur in battle, but in revelation. When a worldview held for millennia is disassembled by a single fact that cannot be denied, and no longer needs to be proven Andari's vessel, the TS Kyber remains still, its systems passive, its proximity respectful, and its singularity, its very aloneness, was what made it unbearable to dismiss. For no empire sends only one ship unless it is supremely confident or dangerously unbalanced, and nothing in Andari's demeanor suggested instability, only certainty. I speak now, she said, voice unwavering, not because I seek submission or apology, but because there are threads that, once pulled, unweave futures we both may regret. And I would ask, while there is still dialogue between us, that you examine carefully what Earth has become, and ask yourself if your fleet, however capable, is still operating on data that is already obsolete. Fleet Marshal Threk's gaze remained fixed on her, and when he finally replied, it was not with insult nor denial, but with the weighted cadence of someone adjusting course mid-flight. Your restraint, he said, is impressive in scope, perhaps in sincerity, but the question I now ask is not what you can do, Admiral. It is why you have waited, why you have hidden this architecture of readiness beneath a mask of planetary fragmentation and internal entropy. Andari did not blink. It was not hiding. she said. It was survival strategy. Her tone became quieter, not softer, and that difference mattered. We fractured because our foundations were unstable. We warred because our fears outweighed our foresight, and every time we emerged from crisis, we built memory into machine, behavior into system, consequence into code. We did not hide our progress, Marshall. We buried it beneath layers of volatility, until the volatility itself became the defense. And you, like others before, you saw the chaos and assumed weakness. Vosk turned slowly and looked once again upon the telemetry from the Tenebris array, which remained inert but not dormant, like an animal that has no need to show its claws, because it has already drawn a line in the dust with its shadow. He spoke now not to Andari, not to Threk, but to the record, as he always did when moments surpassed tactical understanding. We once believed that deterrence was forged in fire and refined in steel, he said aloud, letting the ship's record systems capture every syllable. But here is a species that forged it in ambiguity, coded it into uncertainty, and wielded it not as weapon but as reflection of what we assumed, of what they allowed, of what we misunderstood. Andari raised one hand, fingers spread in a gesture not listed in Vellum protocols, and said, "We did not invite this encounter, but we accept its arrival. We will not fire unless fired upon, but we will not allow precedent of unchecked force to be established over soul space. That era is over. You must decide now, Fleet Marshal, whether you wish to engage in a performance that has already been calculated to your disadvantage, or to step into an accord where both species leave intact what they brought into orbit. Dignity, and the chance to choose differently." Her words struck Threk harder than any kinetic lance could have, because they did not challenge his strength. They offered him a way to use it without proving it. It was not a gift often given asterisk. He did not reply immediately, and the bridge fell into an eerie equilibrium, human and Velen vessels suspended in cold vacuum, armed, observing, interpreting, neither side advancing, neither side recoiling. And yet the future of two civilizations balanced invisibly on the next sentence. Spoken Vosk broke the silence. "Then let us, for the first time in our empire's long record," he said slowly, "consider that restraint is not surrender, and that in the quiet before action there may exist a better language than we've ever written with weapons." Threk turned his head slightly. Not enough to surrender command, but enough to allow Vosk to continue, which in Velen culture was equivalent to an official pivot. "Admiral Reza Andari," Vosk said formally, "on behalf of the Velentar Exploratory Division, I request preliminary terms for a non-retaliatory exchange beginning with shared testimony regarding the event over Saturn, and a mutual suspension of escalatory movement." Andari gave the slightest nod. "The terms are acceptable," she said, "and with that, without a treaty signed, without a shot exchanged since the first strike, and without so much as a handshake or seal, Earth and Velentar entered the most fragile of interstellar states, not peace, not alliance, but the pause that history would later call the moment the future pivoted quietly, without ceremony, on the axis of unspoken comprehension, and Earth, the once overlooked cradle of chaos, had become a civilization that had turned survival into strategy, strategy into deterrence, and deterrence into diplomacy without needing to prove its strength in open war. It had already done so in silence. For all their mastery of stellar navigation, for all their archivists and chronologists, the Velentar had no term for what was now unfolding. This was not surrender. Nor was it treaty, not ceasefire, not alliance, not even détente in the traditional sense, and yet it was real, solid as the mathematics of starlight and the warheads dormant in their bays. The TA Skyber remained in position, motionless except for subtle shifts to maintain distance as orbital drift tugged at the ships in their silent ballet above Earth's upper atmosphere, and the Velen arc, vast enough to eclipse entire regions of planetary night, held its formation like a cathedral of hesitation surrounded by a fleet built for annihilation that now had no war to conduct. Fleet Marshal Euron Threk had not moved in 34 minutes, and his silence was no longer the silence of restraint, but the silence of reflection, a foreign condition for a being whose identity had been sculpted by the doctrine of decisive action, whose victories had earned him not merely rank but symbolic authority over a civilization that saw military clarity as the highest form of leadership. Clarity had failed him here not because his ships were inadequate or his soldiers unprepared, but because the battlefield had collapsed beneath his feet and revealed a terrain of meaning where weapons were blunt and strategy was measured in implication. And Andari had spoken fluently in a dialect he did not know existed across the ships. Sensorium, Vosk reviewed the compiled interactions of the last 3 hours, now codified into preliminary diplomatic sequence as a new archival class. Contact Event 2977H. Ambiguous mutual recognition without formal submission. A category that had not been used since the early contact with the Shaldir Conclave, who communicated entirely in pheromone-laced light pulses and were, to this day, still not understood. But Earth was different. They had been understood too late. They had not just responded to the arrival of Velentar force. They had anticipated it, mapped it, prepared for it, and absorbed it into a doctrine that required no retaliation to project power, no overt threat to achieve control, and no formal declaration to alter the velocity of interstellar diplomacy. And now, the consequences of that understanding would echo across not only this system, but every system where power had become predictable, and thus, Brittle Dari's image remained on the display, her face composed, her silence patient, as though she understood that this moment, the moment after surrender, had been refused, but before aggression could be justified, was one she had prepared for longer than any missile's flight time or drone launch path. "I believe," Vosk said carefully, his voice carrying the tone of ceremony though none had been declared, "that it is now necessary for us to consider that this encounter may serve not as an isolated negotiation, but as a precedent for non-linear civilizations, those that diverge from expected development curves and yet attain strategic parity through methods outside our historical frameworks." Threk's jawplate shifted slightly, the only sign that he was listening, and Vosk continued, "Encouraged by the silence that had become permission, humanity has demonstrated capacity for deterrence without empire, projection without presence, and diplomacy without concession," he said, stepping slowly to the center of the bridge as the other officers, though motionless, absorbed every syllable. "And if we do not recognize the significance of this evolution, we risk miscategorizing a civilization that has already exceeded its former classification by at least 2 observational tiers." The words, though formal, were a confession. They had come expecting resistance, perhaps retaliation, and had prepared for conquest, dressed in the robes of retribution instead. They found structure beneath chaos, intelligence beneath entropy, and resolve beneath humility. Threk finally spoke, voice low but deliberate, eyes locked not on Andari's image but on the blue curve of Earth slowly rotating in the main visual frame. "This restraint," he said, "is more dangerous than force, more effective than retaliation, and more difficult to counter than any tactic we've encountered before, because it does not end. It lingers. It adapts. And worst of all, it does not require them to fire again." Vosk nodded once, as if to confirm the thought already blooming in the minds of the bridge crew. "It is not peace they offer," he replied. "It is implication, engineered as doctrine. And implication, once accepted, alters perception more deeply than any bombardment." The word implication had never before been used as a form of power in Velan military speech, but in that moment, it became the axis upon which all further strategy would turn. Andari's voice returned at last, as though timed to allow full digestion of their reflection. "Let this be the first principle of our continued contact," she said with no smile, no flourish, "that you may speak and be heard without firing, that you may act and be seen without invading, that your presence may be known without needing to conquer." The signal cut not with abruptness, but with finality, as though the act of saying enough was itself a calculated move and a board. The Velanarch silence followed, but this time it was not the silence of confusion, nor of preparation. It was the silence of an empire absorbing a new paradigm, and Earth, still quiet below, had rewritten the conditions of first contact not through dominance, but through discipline long after Admiral Reza Andari's transmission had faded, and long after the TS Kyber had begun its slow, dignified withdrawal toward lunar orbit. The silence on the Velanarch persisted not as paralysis, but as recalibration, as though every officer, engineer, and analyst aboard were now parsing not frequencies, not heat signatures or structural scans, but meaning aboard the Ark, in the inner sanctum beneath the command bridge. The chamber of adjudicated memory flickered to life. This was not a war room nor a diplomatic forum. It was where doctrine was re-examined under pressure, where strategic legacies were either hardened or retired. Vosk stood before the central dais, flanked by holographic columns of past engagements, past judgments, and interstellar treaties, now whispering irrelevance under the weight of the unknown. The chamber's walls, inscribed with the names of every species the Velantar had either pacified or outmaneuvered in 6 centuries, felt heavier than before. Every etched sigil suddenly less proud, more questioned. Not erased but reframed. Fleet Marshal Threk entered alone, unaccompanied by his honor guard. That, in itself, was unprecedented. He did not speak for several seconds, simply stood beneath the vast rotating map of Earth, now projected with layer upon layer of Terran infrastructure, scanned and rebuilt by the Ark's most sensitive spectrometric systems. What emerged was not a world of weakness, but of deeply intentional ambiguity. "You know what this is?" Threk said at last, not as a challenge, but as an observation. Vosk, standing still with both hands clasped behind his back in the formal posture of a senior archivist delivering historical truths, replied, "This is the first time we've encountered a civilization that mastered the illusion of disorder to achieve superior stability. They constructed uncertainty not as a barrier, but as a strategy. They engineered opacity as a weapon of delay, while preparing the real defense where we were not looking." Threk stepped forward, the shadow of Earth's rotating holograph washing across his shoulders like a mantle of reluctant humility. "They counted on us not taking them seriously," he said. "And when we finally did," Vosk added, "it was on their timeline, under their framing, within their language of control." The Marshal turned to him fully now, and for the first time since the destruction of the Vorthallan deck. There was no tension in his expression, only weight. "We assumed that technological maturity was tied to visibility, that power was displayed through planetary-scale projects, mass fleets, energy consumption, and open declarations." Threk said, "We assumed any species not echoing our trajectory was beneath response, or only worthy of it after provocation." Vosk gestured, and the map reoriented, focusing now on a region near the Indian Ocean, deep beneath the waves, where only hours before, the Ark's seismic sensors had detected controlled pulses of energy, far beyond what the Terran planetary grids should have been capable of dispersing. They hid entire cities beneath oceans. Vosk said, voice still level, not to protect from attack, but to preserve uncertainty. "Every time we scanned a continent," they answered with a different question. We studied their satellites and missed the fact that their real architecture is likely subterranean, quantum-linked, and modular. We interpreted silence as disorganization. We misunderstood because we were never supposed to understand until it was too late to respond violently. Threk did not argue because he knew what that meant. Earth had studied their enemies without drawing attention. Earth had prepared for a war they hoped would never come. Earth had won the first battle by ensuring it never needed to be fought. He moved to the central console and entered his clearance into the fleet-wide directive system. A single word appeared. Deceleration at command, when confirmed, would slow the entire Velen fleet's operations, signaling a non-aggressive posture without formally requesting ceasefire, a maneuver designed to retain dignity while halting. Escalation. He had never entered that command before. The Admiral looked over his shoulder at Vosk, and the scholar nodded, knowing what it meant beyond protocol. This is not weakness. Threk said quietly, this is repositioning. We are not the apex here, but we are not prey. We are the next students in line. Vosk took a slow step forward, his voice rising only slightly, and Earth, in its quiet brilliance, has assumed the role of teacher not by volume or violence, but by vigilance. They offer no alliance. They issue no demands. But they've taught us that the next evolution of power is not projection, but invisibility until relevance demands emergence. The phrase settled into the chamber like a monument being placed on the Ark's outer decks. The fleet began to shift subtly, respectfully adjusting formation, decreasing energy profiles, halting for velocity. It was not retreat. It was acknowledgement across human networks. There was no celebration, no broadcast, no anthem, no parade, because the humans knew the moment was still fragile. They had not won a war. They had prevented one, and in doing so, had marked themselves not as contenders, but as architects of consequence. From that moment forward, the Velen records would never again refer to Earth by its outdated designation. It would be remembered as Sol Prime, the system where empires came not to conquer, but to reconsider their very definition of strength. In the hours following the deceleration command, an act of restraint encoded into Velen fleet doctrine as the rarest form of strategic admission. The vast formation of dreadnoughts and carriers above Earth did not vanish, did not retreat, and did not disengage. Such an exit would have signaled weakness where there was instead transformation. They remained suspended between two worlds, one of predictable force and the other of evolving meaning, and within the flagship Velenarch, the weight of history was already shifting, not just in data vaults and protocol chains, but in the very language spoken across command decks and archival sanctums. The war planners no longer spoke of trajectories or first strike probabilities. The scholars no longer debated Earth's classification. The engineers no longer searched for energy spikes or launch signatures. Instead, they began decoding silence. Itself, the first to make progress, was 07, a syntactic anthropologist constructed from the neural lattice of 3 retired Velen philosophers. She did not speak often, preferring interpretive overlays and meta-semantic frameworks. But now, she requested audience with both Threk and Vosk in the Chamber of Continuity. When she spoke, her voice was neither mechanical nor entirely organic. It was rhythm given shape. The humans do not merely prepare for war, she said. They prepare for being observed preparing. Every action they take is bifurcated, what it does, and what it is seen to do. They are using the expectation of consequence as the weapon itself. Threk stood still, but his jaw shifted slightly again, the same way it had when the Varthalen Dick was destroyed back when he still believed retaliation was the only viable language. And we are inside that weapon now, Vosk said, understanding immediately what the synthetic scholar Mian07 continued. projecting a series of visual patterns drawn from thousands of Earth-origin electromagnetic pulses gathered over the past 3 days. They use media. Loops, disinformation spirals, simulated civilian chaos, fragmented leadership dialogues, not to deceive us, but to create data camouflage. They flood the observational field with contradictions until the truth is not hidden. It is invisible beneath probability noise. Shrek exhaled slowly. So their chaos is calculated? Yes, Zero said, tilting her head 1 degree. And they've maintained this state for generations, long enough to adapt not just technology, but culture to ambiguity. The result is a civilization that can act decisively while appearing disorganized. That is why we misread them. They didn't evolve along our vectors. They evolved along interpretive misdirection. There was a long silence in the chamber as this thought settled. They had arrived expecting to intimidate an inferior culture into either submission or diplomatic compliance. What they found was a civilization that had weaponized perception itself. Earth's greatest weapon was not in its orbitals, or its stealth platforms, or the Tenebris array. It was in the way it made others define it incorrectly. Until it was too late to adjust on Earth, Reza Andari stood alone in the midsection of the Kyber, her hands folded behind her back, facing a projection of the Ark as it hung motionless above the rim of the atmosphere. She knew intimately, precisely that this quiet pause would not last forever, nor was it meant to. Eventually, Valentar would adapt. Eventually, someone else would come who would not pause, who would not interpret correctly, but for now Earth had bought time for newer systems to finish training. Time for younger minds to inherit a doctrine of restraint, not retaliation. Time for humanity to shift from being observed to becoming the observers. She pressed a signal node, speaking not into open space, but into the classified recording systems of the Terran Assembly. Archive entry. Echo. Response cycle completed. Status. Velen deceleration verified. Threat potential. Contained by conceptual offset. Recommended action. Disseminate fragments of new doctrine to outer sector surveillance beacons. Maintain narrative of instability. Do not allow consistency to form. The illusion remains our shield. Her voice was calm, but resolute. We do not win by showing strength. We win by making strength irrelevant. Back aboard the Ark, Vosk watched Earth's rotation, its oceans, shimmering and unbothered. Its cities, active but unarmed. Its skies, strangely open. He spoke without turning to Threk when they finally taught. Use the shape of their silence. I realized they had never been trying to stop us. They were only asking if we were intelligent enough to listen before they made us irrelevant. Threk nodded once slowly, deeply, and for the first time in his long career, he issued an order not to fire, not to maneuver, not to prepare for response, but to listen longer. And in that quiet command, Earth's victory was sealed, not in dominance, not in conquest, but in the subtle shaping of narrative, the kind that echoes across stars, reshaping how empires see not only their enemies, but themselves. By the 32nd Terran hour of orbital standstill, the Velantar High Directive, Council long accustomed to receiving post-battle declarations of victory or reports of forced planetary compliance, received instead something entirely alien, a delay. The encoded communique from Fleet Marshal Euron Threk was simple, unsentimental, and profoundly destabilizing in what it did not contain. There were no figures of losses, no kill ratios, no territorial gains, no security thresholds breached. Instead, the flagship's update consisted of 3 terse classifications: status, strategic posture reassessment outcome, contact recontextualized, action. Tactical deceleration initiated by consensus in the core chambers of Velen High Strategy on their homeworld, Tarkel V. Elder tacticians murmured discontent beneath ceremonial masks of composure. their claws curling lightly around the edges of their stations, not in panic, but in the rare tension of encountering a concept long theorized and seldom encountered. A power they could neither outgun nor outguess. The concept had a name in ancient Velen, Narration, translated loosely as a shadow that moves slower than sound but faster than thought, a term used historically to describe phenomena that forced empires to change shape without violence and earth. It seemed had become that shadow within the arc. Vosk stood before a full assembly of the senior fleet command, his voice projected across layered decks and sub-command theaters, no longer speaking as archivist but as interim diplomatic strategos, a role invoked only when military advantage had failed to produce dominance. This event will not be remembered for what we fired, he began, voice deliberate, shaped by the new gravitas of failure turned understanding, but for what we did. Not fire, and what we finally heard when silence was no longer a void, but a language we had never bothered to translate. No one interrupted. He gestured, and the primary data stream revealed a flattened harmonic graph of Terran broadcast fluctuations, random. At first glance, but beneath the surface, a fractal pulse. You see this as noise. But when we slowed it by a factor of 1,000, we discovered rhythmic synchronization across civilian, military, and orbital communications patterns that suggest not unity of command, but unity of anticipation. They prepared for us, not with weapons, but with systems capable of learning from our presence faster than we could learn from theirs. From the back of the chamber, Commander Saralin, the fleet's youngest dreadnought operative and once a rising voice for immediate reprisal, spoke. Now with moderated tone, they've turned unpredictability into doctrine. How do we counter an enemy that never reveals intent until after we've made our decision? Vosk answered without pause. We do not counter them. We mirror them. Threk, seated now not in command posture, but in the solemn evaluation seat of the fleet's judicial forum, finally lifted his gaze. They've taught us a new weapon, he said, and though his voice was hard, it was no longer proud. One that we can no longer pretend is beneath us controlled invisibility. They knew they could not match us in open battle, so they made battle irrelevant. They've changed the context in which power itself is understood. Silence followed, but no one feared it anymore. The Terran strategy was now becoming an artifact of study. Earth had joined the pantheon of species not through victory, but through conceptual ascension. They had entered history not as defeated or defiant, but as the beginning of a new model at that moment. A new signal arrived, brief, quiet, unsigned. No encryption, no demand. Only a phrase delivered across a dormant channel. A war avoided is a war already won. Thank you for listening. The bridge held its breath, and for a long moment, no one of Vausk read it again, slowly. Aloud then, turned to the assembly, and spoke in a voice that would be quoted across centuries of diplomatic archives. This is no longer about whether we can defeat Earth. It is about whether we can survive our own expectation to do so. Outside, above Earth, the TS Kyber was gone. No thruster trails, no light distortion, no visible retreat. Just absence, deliberate and untraceable. Another lesson. Presence is not proof in that moment. The Velentar began what they had not done in 600 cycles. They updated their strategic doctrine, not because they were conquered, but because they were changed, and somewhere, far below, on a blue world that once broadcast chaos and now whispered precision, humanity recorded its own quiet victory, not in treaties, not in territory, but in the echo that stayed long after the signal ended. The final days of the Velen presence over Earth passed not in tension, but in the stillness so precise it resembled reverence. The massive ships of the Velentar fleet, built to command the language of force across the galaxy, remained in orbital position, not because they lacked the capacity to act, but because they had encountered something they had not planned for, a civilization that made war unwinnable, not by resistance, but by preemption of thought, and that had changed everything from the far-flung decks of the dreadnoughts to the silent communion chambers of their orbiting adjudicators. The Velen crew did what they had never done after a first contact. They studied a retreat, not tactically, not politically, but philosophically. This was not tactical surrender. It was cognitive redirection, Vosk, now elevated to high interpreter by emergency. Consensus drafted the first official record of the encounter, entitled it with careful restraint. Contact Event 2977-ush. The Vile Descendants in it. He wrote, Earth did not meet us in battle. Earth did not beg, bribe, or bluff. Earth waited, and in that waiting, they taught us the price of assumptions, the danger of predictability, and the elegance of deterrence through perception. They revealed no super weapon, no ultimate command ship, no deity of war. They showed us only this, that to engage them by force would cost more than any victory could return. These words were not merely archived, they were studied, recited, and eventually memorized by future Velen strategists, who would refer to this moment as the humbling meanwhile. Aboard Earth, no overt movement followed. No fleet scrambled in response. No missiles were primed. The TS Kyber, having fulfilled its role, had disappeared into the void between orbital shadows, its signal absorbed by Terran interference clouds, a vanishing act by design. Earth did not broadcast victory. It broadcast nothing, and in doing so, it let its silence carry the narrative forward, a silence that echoed across galactic frequencies with the weight of intent, restraint, and readiness. On Tarkel 5, the Velen High Directive reconvened, not in war posture, but in scholarly retreat. They lit no flames of warning. They declared no expansion of military funding. Instead, they passed a single amendment to Velen doctrine, the first in over 2 centuries. When encountering emergent civilizations, the absence of visible danger shall no longer be equated with vulnerability. Strategic ambiguity is henceforth recognized as an indicator of asymmetric advantage. And thus, Earth became the first recorded civilization in Velen history to be elevated not by conquest, alliance, or surrender, but by inducing caution through conceptual superiority. It was a new form of power, one that didn't reside in strength, but in its refusal to be fully seen aboard Earth. Admiral Reza Andari remained beneath the Antarctic crust, inside the subterranean network known only as Site Omen 3, a place so deeply buried in classified memory that even the Assembly referred to it only as the Threshold. There, she stood, before a table made of obsidian and ferroglass, surrounded by screens showing nothing but static and signal drift. She tapped one interface, inputting her final debrief. Her voice coldly calm, meticulously slow-filled the command sanctum. Valentar fleet has disengaged without formal conclusion. They came seeking submission and found silence. They arrived with presumption and departed with uncertainty. And in that uncertainty lies our safety. Maintain perception layers. Maintain simulation conflicts. Continue controlled appearances of dysfunction. Ensure narrative asymmetry remains stable across all global feeds. Earth must never again appear united, because what they do not believe we are capable of is exactly what makes us dangerous. She looked upward, as if through miles of ice and rock, toward the sky where the Velen dreadnoughts had once glared down with imperial confidence. Now those ships were gone, leaving behind no trace but what they learned. Behind her, a young officer finally broke protocol and asked the question that lingered in many human minds. Admiral, why not show them what we truly are? Why not declare it now? Let the galaxy know we're not to be taken lightly. Andari turned. Her eyes, sharp as ever, carried no anger, only the composure of someone who had walked too close to war to ever worship its clarity again. We already told them. she said softly. We told them everything, we just didn't use words. She approached the exit arch, the automatic doors pulling apart with a hiss-like breath held too long. Before she vanished into the next corridor, she turned once more and spoke, not as a leader to subordinates, but as a sentinel to future generations. Victory that shouts is heard and feared. Victory that whispers is remembered and obeyed. Across the stars, the Velen fleets withdrew from Sol Space one formation at a time, never turning their hulls in full retreat, always backing away with optics fixed on Earth, as if still doubting the full shape of what they had witnessed, and they were right to doubt because Earth's greatest weapon was not a weapon at all. It was the doctrine of misperception, polished over centuries, forged in chaos, refined in silence, not just strategy, but an architecture of patience, designed not to defeat invaders, but to disassemble their certainty, to fracture their assumptions, to replace war with the fear of engaging a mind you can't map in the years that followed. The term Sol Prime would appear in over 17 interstellar codices as a system marked by soft quarantine, not by force field or blockade, but by sheer reputational deterrence. No one invaded Sol, no one dared to observe too closely, no one assumed again that Earth was still climbing the ladder of power, because now Earth was the mirror, and those who approached it saw not the planet, but their own limitations reflected back at them. Thus ended the first contact of Velentharnat, with fire, not with conquest, but with a silence so deliberate, so vast and so dangerous, that it taught a warfaring empire to retreat and remember why they should never return. Forevermore, in both Terran records and Velen scrolls, the encounter would be known as the war that never happened but changed everything.
Thank you for listening, Alien Chronicles. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe our channel for more Galactic Saga. And please visit our channel to get new stories every day.